Good afternoon, everyone. As soon as we manage to get a hold of our third panelist, we're going to start. So bear with me. Here we are. Just let me see if all your permissions are okay. Yes, indeed. Perfect. Everybody can hear me? So warmly welcome back to our afternoon session, to so long awaited panel. It's my pleasure to welcome our moderator, Christina Hoffer, Sustainability Business Lecturer. As our three panelists, EDuC, Phil Baty, and Francesc Pedró. Carina is going to be the one telling you a bit more about our panelists and posing difficult questions that we all need to answer. So welcome, Carina, and you can take over from here.
Thank you so much, Lela, and thank you so much for having me and for hosting this panel. Hello, everyone. My name is Carina Hopper, and I'm very pleased to be here. Sustainability and higher education is a topic that's very dear to me. Just to introduce myself, I'm a university lecturer in Paris, where I teach sustainable business in 4 business schools, including ESSEC Business School and ESMOD Fashion Business School. I also work on projects to connect business school students with social entrepreneurs and startups across Europe. Additionally, I'm working at the moment on the development of a sustainability label for higher education programs under the guidance of French ISO member AFNOR. So I'm going to go ahead and begin by talking a little bit about why we're here and what the purpose of this panel is. Discussing with the organizers of this conference, we really wanted to use this platform to generate more open and honest reflection on the current failings of higher education in terms of sustainability teaching. Many of us have been involved for some time in the conversation around the critical issues in sustainability in higher education. But although the rationale for pushing for more sustainability content in higher education could be considered to be more or less clear now, what is certainly less clear is how to implement cross-cutting integration of sustainability in a way that is likely to have a strong impact and to drive real change. There are many questions left to answer and a lot of research pending on this topic, and we really hope that we are able to spark some further interest among both the research and teaching community as well as among all stakeholders in education. I'm tremendously happy to have with us 3 very distinguished panelists. Phil Baty is Chief Knowledge Officer at Times Higher Education. He led the development of the current methodology of the Times Higher Education World University Rankings. And with his 20 years of experience in the global higher education sector, he has been listed as one of the top 15 most influential people in education. EDuC is Global Education Editor at the Financial Times and writes extensively on educational issues around the world. His Financial Times articles on the topic of sustainability education include Social Purpose, How Business Schools Around the World Measure Up, Business Schools Shift to a More Sustainable Future, and the Rise of the Sustainable MBA, just to name a few. And last but certainly not least, we have Francesc Pedró, the Director of UNESCO's International Institution for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. Formerly a Senior Policy Analyst at the OECD Center for Educational Research and Innovation, he has been with UNESCO's education sector in Paris since 2010, where he now leads the work on teacher development and education policies in the Division of Teachers and Higher Education. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So the way we're going to proceed is that I'm going to ask a series of questions to our panelists who are welcome to jump in at any time. We're really hoping that this can be a rather informal and non-restrictive discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off by asking a question, the question first of Phil Baty. What would you say we're doing right, and what would you say we're doing wrong right now in higher education in terms of sustainability?
That's a big question to start with, but thank you for that. I think perhaps my opportunity is to focus on what some institutions are doing right rather than wrong, because one of the things we're able to do at Times Higher Education is to showcase good practice. We've actually reinvented global rankings for the new era. We've obviously got our traditional world university rankings, which have been around since 2004, but just 2 years ago, we created our impact rankings, which are explicitly framed around universities' delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals, so all 17 goals, and we have an overall ranking. So what we can do is look at good practice, highlight excellence in particular areas. And obviously there's lots of individual pockets of outstanding good practice that we can identify. And it's such a diverse range of institutions doing incredibly well. You know, ASU in America came top of our no poverty list based on the quality of the research they're doing in this area. University of British Columbia topped the climate action list, again, primarily due to research, but also their own stewardship of their own resources and their outreach to other communities. Tokyo University in Japan was leading the way in innovation and infrastructure, and Nanjing Agricultural College in China was leading the way on no hunger. So we can see all this amazing activity. But I think the core message that I've sort of picked up from the rankings, the opportunity for universities to really start looking hard at what they're doing in a really diverse, cross-functional way, and to get a central view of all this great behavior. The thing that stood out for me is that some institutions have genuinely built the Sustainable Development Goals into their core mission, their raison d'etre. They've made it central to what they want to be as institutions. So we've seen institutions like Manchester in the UK, King's College London in the UK, and to some extent Auckland University, which in New Zealand, which came #1 overall, making that conscious leadership decision that these goals will almost underpin their whole research agenda, their entire mission, and understand it at the central level and record it at a central level, so that they are fundamentally putting it at the heart of their strategic mission. So I think that is the game-changing good practice that we're seeing. And bad practice, I think I might leave to some of the other commentators. But yeah, there's plenty of bad practice, which is just presumably neglect of the issue is the biggest problem, I think.
Would anyone else like to jump in there?
Sure, I'll come in. Yeah. So in terms of good practice, I mean, as Phil said, I mean, there's no question there's many different institutions doing many different and interesting things around the whole space of sustainability. And you know, clearly some are offering specialist courses or electives. Some are kind of embedding and integrating in more in a core way, which I personally think arguably has greater value for a greater impact for a wider number of students. But I think we do have to be nuanced. You know, I think realistically different students and faculty have different interests and focus, and we shouldn't expect, you know, everyone to have to come out with the same. You know, some will be more, some will be less interested. I think clearly it's really important that sustainability and social and responsibility issues do form a wider part, I think, of all curricula, but it needs to be in a sense of proportion. So I think in terms of what we're doing wrong, I mean, I think there's just a huge variety of approaches. And I think, yes, I mean, of course, people not doing more is bad, but I actually think I would be a bit perhaps critical here. I think there's a real challenge to the academic world to be a lot more rigorous about this, because, you know, there's lots of, you know, bluntly virtue signaling. There's lots of kind of, it's quite easy to, you know, screw on the label saying you're implementing the SDGs. What does it really mean? It's quite easy to write an article about sustainability, but is it frankly really making a difference? And I think, you know, it's great that Phil and others have been developing all sorts of quantitative assessments and rankings. Personally, I think and this is no critique of those trying to rank, but I think actually the quality of the data on which to make those sort of decisions is still incredibly weak. And I think actually we're providing a course on X or we're providing academic output on Y really isn't good enough. We really have to be saying what difference is there actually making? What is the learning gain of those students going through institutions? What is the impact of research that's taking place in the name, if you like, of sustainability? So that's where I think the academic community still needs to do a huge amount more.
Thank you so much for that. Francesc, would you like to add?
Yes. Thank you very much. I think, first of all, thank you for the invitation to UNESCO to join this panel. It's really a pleasure being surrounded by such big names, particularly in the media. Now, it is difficult from the perspective of UNESCO to say something that really works for the global community of higher education institutions. I think that we have to differentiate very much the different contexts in which higher education operates around the world. That said, I think that I would stress, possibly, just to add some more spice to what has already been said, I would add probably three things, or maybe phrase some things that have been said already in a different way. I think that many universities around the world, also in the developing world, have been extremely successful in transforming the way in which they operate. I mean, it's a very pragmatic perspective, if you wish, but I think that for many communities, seeing how universities operate with water supply, with electricity, I mean, has really a kind of an exemplary effect on the wider community, and of course, in the internal students and professionals. I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of these small gestures that sometimes happen also in very poor contexts where higher education institutions cannot pay for the cost of changing bulbs in order to have leads, but nevertheless they operate very well with their schools of engineering, just trying to see new ways in which they can really reduce waste or operate with water in a different way. I think that this is really very important because in a way gives the message that universities are leading the way in practice as well. Something that they are doing also very well, I think, is in terms of the impact on teacher training for primary and secondary education. I think that universities have done an impressive job, not only now, but also during the past decade for sustainable development. I think the presence of sustainable development in teacher training curriculum around the world is really, really a major success in that respect. And finally, but this has to be also nuanced, I think that something that is really important is that many universities, and I would also insist on that, all, including the developing world, have been very successful in developing a public discourse in favor of sustainable development. And I think that this is really important, but as it has already been said, well, there is a huge distance, sometimes a real gap between what the public discourse says and the real practice, particularly when it comes to research, as it has already been said, as well as in embedding sustainable development in all courses and programs, as well as transforming the way in which the university organize educational provision as well as research. I would talk probably later on this, but I would also would like to say as well and finish with this comment that we can expect the pandemic having an important effect on the way in which universities are operating around sustainability. I think that we have to discuss possibly in which ways some and why some universities are going to be successful in tackle this challenge, and some others are going to fail completely. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. It's interesting what you said about public discourse and there being a disconnect, and we've heard from a speaker earlier in the day, Dr. Willie Legrand, about the disconnect between the attitude and the action, and perhaps that will come up again during the course of our panel. But I wanted to address a topic now that is quite a prominent topic in sustainability education discussions, which is the marginalization of the subject of sustainability in higher education. And so my question, and I was going to address it first to you, Andrew, is do you think that there's a need for sustainability to be the absolute leading paradigm in higher education? Or can we continue looking at it as a marginalized subject? And I know you touched on this briefly before, so I thought as well you would be a good person to begin.
Well, I think it probably needs to be between the two. I mean, it would be certainly a shame if sustainability is marginalized. On the other hand, I'm very loath to sort of try to dictate the whole theory of knowledge and what academics or institutions sort of should or shouldn't be teaching and the ways in which they're doing it. I think there's a role of wider society to try to hold institutions accountable, and certainly to be questioning them and challenging them if they're not doing more to kind of prepare the next generation, and indeed, you know, kind of existing generations that intersect with their research and so on, with issues like sustainability, which clearly are existential for us all. But I think at the level certainly of, you know, so there's a question of leadership of institutions and accountability, but I think it would be deeply regrettable to trying to be dictating every course or every department or every academic to be taking a certain approach.
Thank you. If anyone else has a comment regarding that question, you're welcome.
I think I would, I just agree and say, like, I think one of the most, I guess, the sacred tenet of universities, I think, is that it's a real signal of their opportunities to succeed is institutional autonomy. They need to be free from sort of outside forces saying you must teach this or you must do that. And I think that's a very important principle. But I think what we're seeing really is universities almost inevitably going down this road and putting it front and center because of the fact that it touches on everything that universities are about. You know, their role, for example, in tackling the pandemic fundamentally touches on the SDGs, their impact on good health and well-being. You know, all the multifaceted work they're doing there, and many institutions, I think, have framed their whole mission around looking at the world's grand challenges. I know UCL was a pioneer in that in London. They said, look, we're going to frame our entire research output into broad areas of the world's grand challenges. So, you know, tackling climate action, for example, being one. I know that the UN economists had a report yesterday talking about the sort of 5 key mega trends that are shaping the world. So I think it's almost impossible for universities not to fundamentally touch on the SDGs as part of their teaching and research missions, because it touches every aspect of our lives in that sense. You know, climate change, demographic change, urbanization, technological development, inequalities, they're there and present in all of our everyday teaching and learning across disciplines. So I think it's inevitable, but yes, I think it is important for institutions at the leadership level to say very explicitly and overtly that this is, you know, an important part of why they exist and their role in making the world a better place. And I think there is an issue in actually almost demonstrating the positive impact of universities and needing to make quite aggressive statements that you are contributing to helping the world be a better place, because we've got all these attacks on universities, questioning expertise, questioning whether they're teaching the right subjects, questioning whether the value of going to university is worth the cost in many countries, questioning whether we move to mass education systems. Universities have to almost defend themselves against populist politicians and an anti-higher education and research sort of culture in some populist governments. So I think it's inevitable that they will have to and will continue to drive this agenda.
Thank you. Francesc, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I would like to say just a couple of things. First one is, in a way, Phil has reminded us, the UN has published a report in which we are all reminded of the importance of the crisis we are facing. And I think that I wouldn't say that sustainable development should be the number one idea or number one goal to guide what universities are doing, but certainly it is at this precise moment a good way to address one of the most important challenges that the world is facing, with different symptoms, with different spices, if you wish, but I think that it's certainly a measure taken. Now, that said, how far this can, in a way, translate into a specific practice, to what extent, I don't know, the United Nations or UNESCO, whatever international organization should dictate how to translate this sustainability or sustainable development commitment into practice. Well, that's certainly difficult to respond. But I would probably put another question. To what extent do you think that a serious university, a committed university, at least from a public commitment perspective, can afford not to make sure that all the graduates it is in a way training or just producing can be really, really said to be ready to work, to be really ready to operate in their communities without having at least an introduction to what sustainability means for their particular professional or academic practice. Now, I know that this can take, it can be seen from a very large perspective, but very much reduced, but I think that the real commitment, and I see that as a touch of attention, should be that every graduate um, in a way, exiting a university, should be able to demonstrate the commitment by the way in which he or she operates as a professional or as a member of the academy.
That actually leads very well into my next question, which is, should students be able to choose whether they want to study sustainability or not? Francesc, would you like to answer?
Yes, yes. Well, I think that there are basics, there are basic elements in today's world, in the 21st century, that should be incorporated in any kind of higher education curriculum. So I'm afraid that I wouldn't say that this is, as I already mentioned, should be very large or very, very short, but certainly, I mean, becoming a professional, becoming a researcher in the 21st century today means certainly to learn about how we can make the whole thing, the whole area, the whole work which we are going to unfold in a way, are going to be contributing to a more sustainable model of development. Now, on top of that, and I'm not able to say, whether this represents 10%, 15%, I think that, there should be latitude for universities, for schools, for faculties to determine what makes sense in each case and in each particular context. But that said, I think that also a wider offer of elective subjects related to sustainability should also be considered. And that's, once again, a kind of a test for universities. How many of them have been able to develop a floating offer of courses that can really help not only the future professional or researcher, but simply the citizen, to reflect as a university graduate about sustainability and the way in which we are living.
I think I would jump in on the issue of choice, in the sense of saying, I think if we do have sustainability as an add-on or a potentially marginalized optional extra, then that becomes problematic because it's seen as a choice. I actually think that what needs to happen, and hopefully what is happening, is that it becomes fundamentally integrated into the curriculum across all disciplines. I think we're starting to move towards a situation now where there's an understanding that actually perhaps the most effective education at a higher level is interdisciplinary. It's crossing boundaries with the sort of idealized sort of liberal arts vision from the United States that people do need to have a very holistic view of the world, because to prepare for the fourth industrial revolution, to prepare for the world of AI and automation of jobs, etc., we need this much more sort of liberal arts based education. And then you think once you're in that area, it's almost as if you fundamentally cannot avoid teaching the realities of climate change, for example, the realities of an aging population, the realities of our digital world evolving. So I'd almost hope it inevitably becomes a fundamental part of the core teaching of any institution, and I think that's where it needs to be, rather than saying there's an optional unit here or an optional section there. And I mean, that's perhaps an idealized scenario, but I think given that universities are truth seekers and their role is to help students corral evidence and seek after truth in the most traditional way, it becomes a fundamental part of all teaching to understand the context in which we're all living and working. Maybe I'm being a bit romantic there, but
no. Not at all.
Andrew, would you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I totally agree. in the importance of a holistic education. I mean, my undergraduate degree was some years ago in geography, which was always very much about the idea of, pulling lots of different disciplines together and trying to see the big picture. So I believe in that sort of attempt to open horizons and see broader perspectives and get out of the silo of individual academic disciplines or specializing too early, very much. But I mean, if the question is, should students have the option, should, in other words, universities be required to have courses, then I mean, I think it would be unfortunate for universities to not be providing sustainability in some form. But as I said, I think we don't want to be too dictatorial either. And, again, the challenge back to academia, we really have to decide what and define what sustainability means, because it's a very vague, all-encompassing term. And, I talk to, for example, I'll talk to, thinking about business education, I'll talk to banks who are very interested in sustainable finance at the moment, but they will say to me, I would rather take a bright young student who's got the basics of finance in place, and we can then graft on, perhaps working with universities' sustainability expertise. It could be much more challenging to work the other way around, and we can also risk building false expectations of trying to develop, sustainable finance courses, let's say, which are bluntly a little bit soft, and therefore we clearly need to integrate hard skills and traditional academic insights alongside these sort of wider and societal issues.
I just support Jack's point there on the definitions. I think there is a risk of a perception that sustainability just does mean rather narrowly the green agenda or environmental issues, and people see it in terms of just about recycling or smarter use of energy or use of renewables, and very narrow terms around that, and it is just seen as your greenwashing tick box approach. And I think that's where we do need to think about it as a much more holistic, fundamental understanding of the world we're in. It's the realities, cross-cutting across all of these, these mega trends that I mentioned earlier. So defining it and not labeling it as something more narrow than it really is, I think, is very important.
Absolutely. The kind of confusing and vague element of sustainability as a term leads us to possibly ask whether, if sustainability is forced or essentially being taught in a way that is not very effective, could that actually have negative repercussions?
It's interesting, isn't it, around this whole issue about academic freedom and institutional autonomy. But yeah, if it's taught in a way that feels as if it's a bit preachy or a bit sort of righteous, then there is a risk of alienation or a risk of potentially getting people's backs up. Of course, there is quite a serious movement of denial. There is a real sense that we've got extremely prominent figures on the world stage, Bolsonaro and Trump, very vehemently climate deniers. So I think it almost needs to be treated in that sense of seeking after the truth. Students should be exposed to those ideas, exposed to those different views and opinions, but hopefully through the educational process, just as there are flat earthers and all sorts of conspiracy theorists, that the student comes to a position where they don't feel they're being force-fed an ideology. They feel like they're just being educated to review the evidence and seek truth. So that's a really interesting one, the sort of the political climate of Trump overtly saying that institutions aren't educating anymore. They're left-wing indoctrination centers. He's been very aggressively attacking some of the greatest universities in the world for criticizing his COVID approach. So I think there is a sense that if it's seen as a virtuous force feeding, it becomes problematic. But if it's integrated across the curriculum into that general sense of taking students on a journey to independently review evidence and digest the expertise and the evidence and the scientific consensus, hopefully it leads to a position where they feel very it's an inclusive and integrated part of their education.
Francesc, you have a question or comment?
Yes, yes. No. I completely agree with what Bill has said. I just wanted to say that other than teaching and learning concepts and sometimes the skills about sustainability, I think that we have to take into account that student will spend between 2 and 6 years of his life attached to a particular university. And that means that there are plenty of opportunities where the way in which he lives in the context of the campus, he lives in the context of his particular school, also can teach him or her a lot of things about how sustainability applies to daily life. And in a way, instill the feeling and the need, to ask questions about, who is responsible for switching off lights and that kind of thing. How we use printers, for instance, how we use photocopy machines in university settings. I think that there are plenty of opportunities by which the university has the alma mater. This sense that we need really to change our daily practices and behaviors if we want to really commit to a more sustainable model of development.
Yes, and certainly some of the initiatives you're mentioning start much earlier than in higher education as well. Andrew, do you have anything you'd like to add?
So in terms of the negative aspects, I mean, I think it would be very unfortunate to force students to take, if we like to call it that, sustainability studies, and equally regrettable to try to impose on faculty. I mean, I can clearly see, a reluctant professor who's told he has to or she has to integrate this, who doesn't really believe it themselves. That's clearly going to reflect pretty badly in terms of the vibes and the insights, or the skepticism perhaps, or cynicism that comes out of it. So yeah, I think again we have to keep up the variety. We have to make a persuasive case, create the right incentives, encourage good scholarship and insights over time, but not try to impose it everywhere, and be mindful of the need for high quality teaching and research around sustainability, as academia does in every area of specialty.
Yes, I feel as though this question could be its own panel. We could continue, but I, in the interest of time as well, I'm going to open up the question about rankings, which has been mentioned already, because some of you, Phil, but Andrew as well, I know you have a little bit of insight into the Financial Times ranking. What do you think is the role and the responsibility of university rankings in encouraging sustainable teaching in higher education?
Would you go first, or?
Go ahead, Andrew.
Sure. Well, I think, as I say, I mean, rankings should be about trying to hold institutions accountable, providing insights and, if you like, decision-making tools for students who are applying, as well as indeed faculty and wider stakeholders. I'm a great believer in transparency and in data. As we've already said, I'm not convinced that the data itself is as robust as it needs to be. So I think one's got to be, as with all rankings, contextualizing carefully and trying to understand that, they may be the starting point, but, and this is what we certainly try to do in our approach, and I know Phil does as well, encourage people to not just look at the top line or the aggregated ordinal ranking, but to kind of drill down and understand the nuance, and only use this as one of many pieces of information that's available. But I mean, is there a role for rankings, both in this case, for example, trying to showcase and incentivize and nudge towards deeper thinking and responsible outcomes in teaching, and research in academia? Absolutely, and certainly, like Phil, we've been integrating and are trying to do a lot more in that field to really say, how can we usefully, responsibly, objectively try to quantify and measure these issues that matter. And we're, very interested and open to exploring all sort of ways to do that better. So, we're far from we're far from arriving, but I think the aspiration is a really important one.
Phil?
Yeah, and I think, look, from my perspective, rankings have this extraordinary power to focus minds and to grab attention. So they are inherently crude, they're inherently simplistic when you're, creating a single composite score to try and represent an extraordinary diverse range of activity. But yeah, from Times Higher perspective, this came from the drive towards understanding impact. So we've had the World University Rankings since 2004, very much about a global research elite. It's about research excellence. It's about, we don't measure Nobel Prizes, but it's about, those institutions who are changing the world through their scholarship, often based on research and wealth and prestige and various metrics like that, which, it's a great geopolitical indicator to help us understand the geopolitics of the knowledge economy. But we were getting more and more pressure to understand excellence in different ways and understand how much universities impact society. And we started looking at that in terms of, economic impact, inventing a widget and exploiting that widget and developing IP, etc. But it very quickly emerged that universities themselves were keen to push this idea of saying, look, our impact is perhaps best summed up through the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework, because we impact the world in so many different ways, through influencing political discourse with social science research, through good governance, through outreach to their communities, through the economic growth elements, of course, through the research base, on all those, overt goals around climate action and life on land and life under the oceans, etc. So there's a huge array of impacts. So we decided to use the SDGs as the framework. And it has really helped, I think, do two things. One is it has focused minds in institutions. So a lot of institutions have said the very process of submitting to this has been really healthy for them to understand at a central level the multifaceted activities they're doing, and then to perhaps focus more strategically on those areas. It's obviously showcasing good practice, and we hope that also means that it facilitates collaboration, facilitates new connections, so that we can identify institutions doing great work in particular niches and bring those institutions together, bring them together with NGOs, with government, with the corporate world. But it also, we hope there's a bit of a stick element as well, that it sort of suggests that there's a bit of consumer power, that students might start asking, well, have you, so, it's almost not about being top of this ranking, it's simply being part of it, because theoretically 20,000+ higher education institutions in the world can be part of this. The world rankings are restricted to research-led intensive universities. Perhaps there's only 5,000 of them in the world. This is 20,000+ institutions. It's almost like saying, have you made a public commitment to be transparent and accountable for your work on the SDGs? We have a theory, a sort of fairly high level sort of theory of change. So we look at 4 key areas of a university's activity. We do look at research. Are you producing new knowledge that contributes towards these areas? And that's very challenging around the taxonomy of research, what's contributing to which SDG. But then we also look at outreach, so government relations, corporate relations. But I think the most important ones for us are really the most exciting ones. One of them is stewardship. So we say to the institution, it's not just about preaching to the world through your research what needs to happen, it's about your own stewardship of your resources. These are often multi-billion-pound institutions that are have huge workforces, massively influential as local employers. So we ask them to prove their own stewardship of their resources. So what are your internal policies around energy consumption, for example? And we even go right into the equalities side of things and the decent work side of things. What sort of contracts do you employ people on? Are you paying minimum wage? Are you recognizing trade unions? It's actually very, very complex. And then we obviously do look at teaching. What are you actually doing at the teaching level? But I think as Andrew said, it's the data is incredibly patchy. So we're combining public domain research data with a lot of self-reported material. But because it's self-reported, actually, one of the things that's fascinating is that we're building up an extraordinary resources database, because we're saying to people, let's say we're holding to account on equalities, we'll say how many senior female leaders do you have, what's the ethnic diversity of your faculty, of your students, and we'll be able to measure that and look at that as a harsh metric. But in many cases, we're also saying, do you have a policy on equalities? Do you have a policy against sexual harassment? Do you have mental health services for your students? And we're not necessarily able to monitor and check the effectiveness, but we look for the evidence and we look for the existence of these policies. We look for the fact these policies are in the public domain. And then we also gather all of those documents. So we've actually started to create a really interesting database of good practice, database of policy. So it's a mixture of carrots and sticks. But yeah, our job really is to hold a mirror up to universities, to provide data to universities, the leadership and the stakeholders, and of course the students who want to study there, and just provide a wealth of data that helps them make choices. But I think with this one, we have taken a position that says we want to incentivize this behavior, we want to reward it, and we want to, we're making a conscious choice to hold institutions to account for their contributions on sustainability. So that was a long answer, but it's something we're very passionate about.
Francesc, do you have something to add?
Yes. Well, my perspective is as a bit dissident, I think, or different, I would say. On the one hand, I couldn't agree more on the need, as Jack has already said, on the need we all have to get more data and reliable data. And if we can, translate some of the data into evidence for improving our practices, our policies. That's for sure. That said, we at UNESCO, we understand that there is room for everyone, and certainly, rankings would play a role. But from our, the fact that we at UNESCO are not developing our own system for rankings is already an indication that we have reflected a bit on this possibility, and think certainly that any ranking is a reflection of a framework, of a theoretical framework. Phil has referred, for instance, to the fact that they have their own theory of change, and I'm not opposing to that. What I'm simply saying is that a ranking reflects, as a matter of quantitative data, what you value. And I think that the question here is, who is creating, who is setting, defining that framework? Is that, at national level, policymakers, those who supposedly higher education institutions are accountable to? Is that the academia? Or is a private company, which has all the right to do it, but very professionally, of course, and probably because the company is convinced that there is a market for that. And I think that the way that those rankings are so well received, everyone is theoretically saying, well, it's kind of, it's the demon, it's the devil. But nevertheless, when we are on the top 10, we use the ranking. So I think that there is room, there is a market for that. And I think that that's where the problem comes from our perspective. Well, first of all, participating in that kind of ranking, pulling all the information that is needed to be part of such a major exercise has a price tag attached. And that could be as simply as having the opportunity cost. That distracting some of your resources, particularly if you are working in a very poor context, simply to compile the information in the way that makes sense for taking part in those ranking exercises. Secondly, more importantly, I think that it also gives the signal that higher education globally is open for competition, which it is true, right? But for us, it's not really the message that we should be sending. The message should be about how can we reinforce the opportunities for cooperation. Inevitably, resources are scarce, so we have to compete at some point. But I think that adding, a layer of rankings is reinforcing very strongly this idea that we are here to compete. I don't think that we can support that from our perspective. On the contrary, what we are in a way supporting at UNESCO is a more contextualized perspective about the way in which things could be improved. I mean, the way in which one particular institution, which is operating in a very, very different context from a different university, which is part of the Ivy League, can do things and is actually doing things to improve teaching, learning, and research, the commitment to the community. I think that it's far more useful to understand not who is doing best, but actually why we can why things could be improved and how to do it, and then helping particular institutions, especially the ones who lack more resources, to get on the right path. So that said, I'd like to insist there is room for everyone. I would welcome certainly even more rankings, but certainly that's not something that UNESCO would promote. I mean, if there is a market, good for you. If you find them useful, good for you. But we'd rather go a different path. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I just add on the back of that. I completely 100% accept your position. Of course, Times Higher Education is a commercial organisation. There are a few things we try and do to address some of the issues around resource. So for the first case is that this impact ranking is entirely voluntary. You have to make a conscious choice to submit, and I think there is a significant burden on the universities to submit data because it's very, very demanding. But one of the things we've tried to do to really understand the difference in resources, we know that the likes of MIT, for example, have a 20-strong institutional research team with data specialists, at a very senior level in the president's office, understanding institutional data, and they have the resource to contribute. The University of Toronto in a similar position, they've got that. So we do have this voluntary system, but we also allow institutions to choose to submit to individual SDGs. So if you're more challenged in terms of resources, or you don't have a huge amount of internal capacity to gather all this information and provide all the evidence, we're really happy to work with institutions on single SDGs. They may have a pocket of excellence or a focus on, local economic growth and infrastructure, for example, or equality. So we're really trying hard to, well, A, make it voluntary, B, not require institutions to submit masses and masses and masses of data. They can pick and choose. And if you want to be ranked overall, you have to submit to a minimum of 3 SDGs and also 17. 17 is compulsory. It's about sharing, it's about collaboration, it's about partnership for the goal. So we're working hard. I do think we have a responsibility to use the ranking as the eye-catching moment of public attention, and it does have a power to concentrate minds. But as Andrew mentioned earlier, the need to allow people to break down those composites and understand individual data sets. So move from a ranking as the sort of theatrical starting point, but really encourage the institutions themselves to disaggregate, break down that information, create networks, profiles, to support good practice, because that's ultimately it's celebrating excellence and highlighting it in a public way, but ultimately this becomes more powerful if it's actually promoting sharing and good practice, and that's going to be our big USP on this one.
Francesc, would you like to briefly respond to that?
Yes, very briefly. I think that I completely understand that perspective, and I think that, as I said already, the work that you are doing is really very professional, very of the highest quality from a technical perspective. However, the question for me is whether from the value system of the United Nations, a ranking is really helpful, or instead, if we, instead of having just a ranking, we could have more knowledge about, how a particular university has moved from position A to position B, and what lessons can be learned from that particular perspective. So in a way, translating what makes a good university when it comes to sustainability, into something that is actionable for others as well, taking into account the particular context in which they live. So I think that if I have to put my own efforts into this, I prefer rather, that kind of avenue, which is more intended towards ensuring that a very little university makes some progress, rather than highlighting who in the country where it is operating is the best university, because we all know what the reasons and the factors are for expanding these programs first. Thank you.
I'd just come back on the UN system. I mean, it's true there's obviously a reluctance for obvious political reasons for the UN to be engaged in rankings. Although, I mean, there are precedents. I was discussing this the other day. I mean, well, it's interesting. The World Bank just came out with the so-called Human Capital Index. It eschewed ranking them, but it had done 2 years ago. So there was obviously some politics behind the scenes, but it still gave the data. So nothing's to stop anybody then doing the ranking for themselves. And let's not forget, the Human Development Index, for example, does rank countries. So there are a number of UN structures and related structures, the OECD, of course, with PISA and so on. I think it's important to not be obsessively looking at the ordinal ranking, but it is really important to collect this data and use it in a more detailed way, as I see someone here's been pointing out on the chat, as a form of benchmarking, for example, also between institutions, and to drill down into those details. So I think it's it's an eye-catching way in, and it's part of a broader ecosystem that has a lot of value to it.
This is such a fascinating discussion. I wish we could continue just talking about this topic. But I did want to open the floor quickly. I had asked if anyone would like to prepare a question for your colleagues on the panel. You're welcome to go ahead at this time.
I think the question I thought that I struggle with a little bit is, how do we incentivize a more holistic approach between different sectors? So obviously I'm focusing exclusively on higher education and what they can do and what universities do, but really this is such an important issue that governments, universities, corporates and charities and NGOs need to unite on. And I'm really keen on this idea of how do we really start to integrate action in that way. And actually, of the report yesterday from the UN economists, how do we actually start to see these disparate, the mega trends they've pointed out? How do we start to see them as almost completely interrelated, in the sense that they're collectively mounting up to some major existential questions for humanity? So it's really about incentivizing, sharing and collaborating across sectors. We're trying to do what we can within the university sector, but how do we get them? How do we get out of that, out of those silos, and really promote that cross cultivation? And I don't have any answers other than public data is helpful. Public data and matchmaking can play a role, so maybe rankings have a role there as well.
Yeah, I see there's a comment here about the idea of rankings is good, but it leads to competition, which is a fundamental barrier for interdisciplinary study. But I'd actually argue to the contrary. Well, one, I think competition isn't necessarily bad, and accountability likewise. But two, I think there's a lot of increasing work suggesting that interdisciplinary, multi-author, multi-institution work has a greater impact. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the one contradicts the other.
Yeah, and actually, just to really reiterate that, I think one of the things we've seen with Times Higher, with this ranking, there was a genuine sense that no one really knew who was doing really interesting things in these areas, overtly related to the SDG. So even by highlighting this good practice, we're creating, we hope, a framework for sharing, a framework for collaboration. And then within the metrics, there are overt incentives to share. So, in the world rankings, we look at international co-authorship of research as a positive. It's more highly impactful. With the SDGs, we do insist that universities submit on SDG 17, which, overtly says we need to be in partnership. So we really hope that rankings foster the healthy competition that helps to drive action, but absolutely create a framework and an accountability mechanism that helps and supports sharing and collaboration.
Yes, yeah, very difficult. Well, in a way, I think that when Jack has referred to the importance or the principle of competition, I mean, uh, yes, in a market that's fine, but the perspective that we have at the UN is that we need to create first a common ground, and when it comes to higher education globally, we don't have yet that common ground. And as a matter of fact, that's why I'm, advocating for, having a different approach, which could be, in many respects, complementary. But certainly, it's not in our list of priorities to promote competition, among higher education institutions. Not even competition to see who is the best when it comes to sustainable development. And let me add a figure to that because I think it's important. In a report that we published, I think it was at the beginning of the year, which was a compilation of some prior research, we demonstrated, we unveiled that as a matter of fact, research about SDGs is mostly, at least was until the beginning of the year, an European-centric endeavor. I think that it's really very, very important to see that reviewing those bibliometric articles, it became very clear that, for instance, many big names, U.S. universities that you would probably find very top in the rankings, are not really there when it comes to research for sustainable development. That's an example. And then it is also important to see that the research on SDGs in general is absolutely absent in low-income countries, where precisely we need to invest more in that particular domain. So I think that I prefer to look at the area of the contribution of higher education to sustainable development more in terms of where can we put the effort to make sure that even the poorest countries, the poorest universities have opportunities and are recognized and supported in moving ahead, rather than getting to know whether competition can help them or not.
Thank you. Do Francesco or Andrew, do you have a question you'd like to bring up for your colleagues?
Yes, I have pretty one. Pretty one. What do you think it is the role of media when promoting cooperation among higher education institutions across the globe? What do you think is the role? Because I know very, very well that you are clearly, from your perspective, promoting competition. So what's your role when it comes to promoting cooperation? Did you see any?
You're asking me?
Anyway.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't think our role is promoting competition. I think our role is a mixture of, holding institutions to account, informing and providing insight, prioritizing news of importance and value. I think that can be just as much about cooperation as it can about competition. We write lots of case studies and interesting questions about best practice. We write about all sorts of issues of concern and areas that go wrong, all of which can be a way to raise profile an issue, draw attention to it, and hopefully stimulate, amongst others, academic institutions to think about solutions as well as ways of joint working. So I don't think the existential issue is competition in terms of what the media is doing, or indeed, simply what rankings are doing. But I think, I would say accountability and transparency, and because objectively there are differences. Frankly, as we've discussed earlier, there are countries, there are institutions, there are courses which are better, and others which are worse. And we love them all to become better, but particularly in societies where, like the UK and the US and increasingly across Europe, where higher education, for example, is a very expensive proposition, it's also absolutely right that the people who are investing their own money and time in it should understand the differences so they can make an informed choice about where best to go.
But is that the role of media or should that be the role of, I don't know, the public administration?
Well, I don't
Or
think this
both?
is, well, indeed. I mean, I don't think it's, I don't think we want to get everything to be regulated or legislated either. I think we need freedom and liberty.
Okay.
But of course, the media is one of a number of important pillars in society if it's to function properly.
Yeah, I mean, I just add, obviously Times Higher Education is a media organization, but we're B2B, and we've also evolved very rapidly over the last sort of 5 or 6 years to be a little bit more focused on data and insight. So we're sort of the company's pivoting a little bit, but yeah, absolutely, the fourth estate is there to hold the powerful to account. What was the line? Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. But from THE's perspective, it's really about intelligence and insight for the university community itself. And for our perspective, that does mean, holding a mirror up to them in terms of helping them set their strategy, understand the landscape, provide the data and insights that will help them do their jobs better, improve and develop as institutions. And we do that through data. And absolutely, we would see ourselves as a facilitator, and that's probably moving slightly beyond our media role. But one of the things I do is I manage our international events, and we run a very successful series of events, and we see those as incredibly powerful areas where people come together to share best practice, and there's great content, great the sage on the stage sharing their institutional stories, but the networking we're seeing, the collaboration that emerges. So we see ourselves as facilitators of universities' excellence, but if we can provide data and new insights to help them do their jobs better, and absolutely that includes finding new partners, finding new collaborative opportunities, sharing good practice, then it's fundamentally part of our role.
Francesc, you have a final.
Yes, just a very short comment. No, I think I completely agree. I completely understand your perspectives in both cases. But let me say something. I think that the particular case of higher education as an educational sector shows a degree of failure that cannot be seen, for instance, in the school sector, where you see that public administrations have also, of course, everyone would support the idea that there is a fourth estate, that we need that kind of independent approach, that accountability from a journalistic perspective can also play a major role. But what I'm trying to say is that in higher education, in many countries of the world, we have a failure, because your role is not really matched by a similar role by the academic community on the one hand, and on the other hand, by the policymakers community, to which I think higher education institutions should be accountable in many respects as well. I think that there is something in the air, so to say, when it comes to higher education that makes it totally different from the school sector, where we have, as a matter of fact, rankings proposed by international organizations that are then used by media like the ones you represent. And in this particular cases, we have rankings promoted by media and then used by policymakers and even by higher education institutions as well, which I think is a paradox. So I think that from our side, we have to work more to make sure that this failure is really addressed in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesc. Andrew, perhaps you have something to say about that, and I would also invite you to ask your question if you have one prepared.
No, I agree. There are policy failures and there are gaps in the ecosystem. Of course, once you're talking about higher education, you're in a different domain to school, because of course it's no longer a legal compulsory requirement, and it tends to be increasingly open to people moving cross borders to study and enrich their experiences in different countries to their own, which I think is great. So yes, there can be some imbalances, but I think over time, hopefully, the media can play a role in trying to enrich that wider ecosystem and encourage a more kind of supported approach and environment for a richer form of higher education overall. Personally, as I said, and like Phil, I mean, yes, we're involved and we see ourselves as playing a role to report, to highlight, be a service, to facilitate conversations, to showcase really interesting ideas and innovations and impact. I'd love to see that report you mentioned that you'd been involved with at the start of this year, Francesc. I hadn't seen that one, but you know, always very interested in different thoughts and ideas from outside and within academia about how most conveniently to develop, to innovate, and to measure the impact of what they're doing.
I think I just throw in a one-liner there, really, just around the regulation and the government area. I think universities and the media are very similar in the sense that it feels to me, you know, really unhealthy if they're over-regulated. You know, freedom, free ideas, free expression of ideas. Government regulation of ideas is a bit scary when you have people like Donald Trump, you know, President of America, and Bolsonaro, Oberon. So there are some real issues around that freedom and autonomy and freedom of ideas and expression and academic freedom, but also working with societal responsibility. So that balancing act of understanding universities have a mission to society, they have a mission to the tax-paying public that fund them. It's a delicate balancing act, but yeah, too much regulation is a little bit nerve-wracking.
True, but there is also an opportunity for self-regulation, isn't it? I mean, and let's take the example. I mean, you mentioned, Phil, that you felt the need for some more data and evidence, saying that that kind of evidence wasn't available before. But I can remind you that, for instance, there is the International Association of Universities, which operates globally, I mean, and has been producing a number of reports, you know, and showcasing how many universities around the globe are, you know, struggling to make a contribution to just one particular SDG. So I think that in a way, well, it's not only between media and government. I mean, the particularity of higher education institutions is that they are used to be autonomous, and they have also the capacity to be self-regulated in many respects. So it's more complicated in a way. Thank you.
I agree.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I truly would continue. I think it's becoming more heated and more interesting as time goes on. But we have 5 more minutes. I just wanted to ask if maybe each of you wanted to just say some final remarks, a minute, 2 minutes. Keep it as short as possible, but if you'd like to say something before we go.
I just do I said before I was going to do a one-liner, and it was much more than one line. But no, you know, we understand rankings are inherently crude. They don't capture some extraordinarily powerful things that are happening. And I agree, we need to match the data and rankings with human stories and case studies. But I do think, you know, rankings have this extraordinary, for good or ill, have this extraordinary power to concentrate and focus minds. So if we can use them as a stick and a carrot to try and support good practice and support behavioral change, then I'm really pleased to be able to do it. But recognizing the caveats and the contextual challenges, and the fact that Times Higher want to work very collaboratively and supportively with the sector, with organizations like UNESCO, to really try and move together towards a better delivery of the SDGs and obviously a better future.
Thank you, Phil.
Yes, please. No. What I wanted to say, despite this kind of dialogue, I think that rankings are here to stay. And you know, the fact that we at UNESCO haven't developed our own doesn't mean that you know, we don't really appreciate the emergence of different perspectives that you know, that can be helpful to some extent. But I would like to finish or to finalize my intervention simply making a call. And I think that the ones who have supported those rankings have an enormous power, you know, and as a representative of the higher education sector, I think that we have to find ways to counterbalance that immense power that you have, either by working collaboratively, as you have said, or by assisting countries and assisting institutions to find additional ways, maybe less quantitative, more qualitative, or more in the line of audits rather than submitting information. I don't know, but at the moment, as I tried to say, I mean, you are the only ones, and that's probably very good for you, but not necessarily for the sector. So we have to move and quickly. That said, you can count on us. Thank you.
Final comment from Andrew.
Yeah, well, I think it's great that this subject is being discussed. It sounds like a really interesting sort of initiative to try to bring together these different players. Yes, I mean, as Phil said, there are limitations to rankings on their own, but they're a starting point. And I think the challenge is to find mechanisms to distill, to analyze, to report on, and to encourage the wider rollout of research and teaching that has social impact and that drives greater sustainability in society. So I think the challenge to the whole community, and the media, the rankings are only a small part of it. We've talked about the institutions themselves, about regulators and policymakers, is to think of ways to flag up, to incentivize, to showcase, to replicate and to partner around these areas. But as I said at the start, I think the community still needs to think a lot more about how to measure the results and to share them. And I think there probably is some need for a sort of, I don't know, a benchmark, a set of standards, some ways to actually get different institutions to be able to think in a useful, consistent partnership way about how they integrate sustainability, how they measure the value of knowledge and of teaching, what the impact is, and the nature of research that they're producing, because these are fundamental issues for all of us, and some greater consistency, transmission, sharing, measurement around those things is part of the piece.
Thank you so much to all three of you. I could not have concluded better myself. We are out of time, unfortunately, and I do apologize to anyone who had questions in the chat. Perhaps if you have questions that have gone unanswered through the panel, you can address them to the conference organizers, and we can take care of them or readdress them to the panelists if they're willing to continue the
Sure.
discussion.
Thank you.
It's really been an honor and an immense pleasure, and I cannot thank you enough. And yes, please continue your important work, all three of you, in this area.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you. It has been really a pleasure and an honor. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure listening to the panel. Honestly, we all enjoyed it very, very deeply.